Hello, I'm Deepak Patel. I'm responsible for the OT and IoT security business here at Zscaler, and I'll be going a little bit into the technical depths of how we're enabling zero trust for OT and IoT. There are a few use cases, and I'll go a little bit into how our customers are deploying this. So let's start with this. So what are we doing with respect to zero trust for OT and IoT? It's the same puzzle pieces. You have your users, you have the internet, you have your data centers, you also have your OT systems that need to be connected to the internet or vice versa. So what's our number one use case that we're seeing today? When you look at a number one use case, it happens to be a vendor or an employee connecting to your OT system. Now, what's different about this? Your OT systems cannot be patched. They're running older operating systems. So connecting using VPNs and firewalls would just bring the threat right into your doorstep. So what are we doing here? So the vendor can come in from an unmanaged device and can effectively communicate directly with your OT systems. And we are deploying a small component here called as an OT connector. Right. So these are important components. The reason for that is this connector is doing an inside-out connection to the Zscaler cloud. Now, what is the vendor doing? So the vendor is also connecting to our cloud. The very first thing that happens by our mode of deployment is your OT systems are effectively protected from the internet or unauthorized users because it's an inside-out connection. There's nothing that you really have to do from a firewall perspective. What happens from the vendor side, they're coming from a browser. There's no agents to be deployed here for this vendor. And when they authorize themselves, they have to connect to an identity platform of sorts. And that will do all the MFA that you have as a requirement. And the vendor themselves don't have to deploy any agents. So all they're doing is they're opening up a browser and they're saying, I need to, let's say, connect to this resource, which is probably, let's say, RDP or SSH. So when they initiate that RDP connection, what really happens in this scenario is this vendor opens up a browser and says, I want to connect to that RDP system. So through the Zscaler cloud, we've already verified who this vendor is. Now we are to the point of they're coming from an unmanaged device. So our enforcement, our control and enforcement says, okay, put them in an isolated path. So how are we isolating their RDP session? So it just so happens that when they initiate that connection, this OT connector converts this RDP into a HTML5 stream. That is what it's doing. That is the main piece of the puzzle here. So this RDP to HTML5 isolation is how we are delivering that RDP stream to this vendor so they can do all their functions that they need to do, but at the same time, they cannot bring in any malware or ransomware into your environment. I know this is a simple high-level diagram, but just remember the fact that the vendor does not have to install anything, or there's nothing that we install on the device itself. It's an OT connector that can be deployed as what you call as a Docker container. So this is available in a container form factor. So that's important to know. So this is, at a high level, the remote access use case, and you can do this even for employees. So this use case number one, I'll repeat it, it's privileged remote access for vendors or employees into their OT systems. Now, when you look at it, OT systems are not talking to themselves, they need connectivity to the internet. So how do they connect to the internet? So different modes of connectivity available. So we can do either an IPsec tunnel, which means when you take your entire factory setup as one box like here, you can use an IPsec tunnel for the entire site and connect it to the Zscaler cloud. And from there, you can connect to the internet. If the IPsec tunnels is too granular, too coarse of a policy that you can enforce there, you can do another option called the branch connector. So think of the branch connector as your default gateway. This is a VM form factor that's available today. This is part of our Zero Trust for SD-WAN offering. So this allows for a more granular control of that policy there. So that's what happens with the branch connector. We also have customers who are natively using the client connector. For devices where you can actually deploy the client connector, you get access to both the internet as well as your AWS and Azure data centers. I'll get to that use case shortly. So these are the three modes that you can use to connect, let's say, devices to the internet. So what happens if an employee or a vendor wants to connect to the internet from your factory location. So once I bring in, let's say I bring in a vendor over here, and they say that they want to get access to the internet. They don't have to use any of these mechanisms. That vendor can take an alternate path, what we call as the crowd browser isolation. So they could do browser isolation. And this is an important piece of technology. The reason for that is you're now allowing that vendor to connect to the internet, but you're not bringing the bits back from the internet. You're only streaming the pixels down to that user. So that's what allows for that isolation. So even if they browse to a site that has malware or ransomware in it, there's no way that can propagate back. It's a similar piece of what we talked about when a vendor is connecting to that OT system there. So these three, like when you're talking about users, when you're talking about devices that connect to the internet, this is how it's done. But there's also a use case wherein your OT systems need connectivity to the data center. So let's say there's a manufacturing execution system that you've consolidated in your data centers or in AWS or in Azure. So you need a way to get this connected. So how would you do it? So it could take the same path of the IPsec branch connector or even the client connector. It's just a slightly different path where it connects to our cloud, and from there we can go to this. But there is an additional component called the app connector that needs to be deployed at this level or this layer to achieve that connectivity. So as you can see, there's a few puzzle pieces that you can play around with, but you get all kinds of connectivity, whether it's the vendor connecting to the OT systems, whether it's the factory that's connecting to the internet, or it's sensors or IoT devices that need access or connectivity to your private data center. So I hope I've given you a good overview of how these solutions are deployed and how customers are getting the benefit of Zero Trust for OT today. We'll go a little deeper into in other sessions regarding the technical nature of these deployments. Thank you.